You're listening to Spiritual Matters with Energy.
It is Radio Verulam. It's Spiritual Matters with Energy through until 10. Now, we're going to join up with Joe Dispenza. We've been talking about him over the last couple of weeks. Joe, I can tell you, has taught thousands of people to rewire their brains. Joe, hi, good evening.
Hi, Energy. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Now, I think maybe we could probably just start by getting an understanding of what kind of brought you into this world of wanting to understand brain function.
Well, I think for the most part, when we learn a little bit about who we are, the nature of reality, how we function, how the brain works, I think it gives us a little bit information about ourselves, and it helps us to begin to make some, refined choices in our life and give us a greater understanding. So I pretty much was asking a lot of big questions at an early age, and then had the privilege of being run over by a truck in a triathlon, and that kind of started me on my journey. I broke 6 bones in my back and was told I'd never walk again and would suffer, some serious problems if I didn't undergo a radical surgery. And I decided against the surgery and thought, if there's a power within us that gives us life, that power that made the body also heals the body, and decided if I could make contact with it and give it a plan, give it a template, give it specific orders, and then get out of the way, maybe it would begin to do the healing for me, and started me on my journey.
And what actually happened? You say you went into yourself to try and sort this out without having treatment.
Well, I had bone fragments on my spinal cord. I had 6 compression fractures, and the bone fragments, of course, were pressing up against the cord, and they wanted to basically 4 leading surgeons in Southern California wanted to basically open me up from the back and take out the back parts of my vertebrae from pretty much right around between the above the shoulder blades all the way to the very bottom of my spine. So about, 14 inches, 16 inches, I don't know what that is in centimeters, but, a good distance there, 30 centimeters or so. And I decided against that because I just couldn't imagine myself living with a handicap. And so I thought, there is an intelligence within me that's giving me life, and it certainly doesn't know how to heal this thing completely based on, where human beings are genetically, but maybe if I could show it what I wanted, to give it a clear picture. So I 2 hours a day, I would basically lay down. Well, I was laying down anyway, but I would sit still and I would reconstruct my entire spine, from top to bottom, and rebuild every vertebrae like I was replastering the individual segments. And then if I got distracted or if my mind wandered to something else, I'd stop and start all over again. And I wanted to get a very, very clear picture. The other thing I did is I just decided that I wasn't going to let any thought go by that I didn't want to experience. So that was probably the more difficult of the two, because when you have conventional, medical model telling you that you probably won't walk, that leaves a pretty good impression. So it was quite a battle and quite a match of will. But as I noticed, as I continued, every day got a little bit easier, and pretty much I was, back on my feet in 10 weeks, and then back into my life again in a week after that.
So you got completely back to normal through this process. Mm-hmm. Okay, now it's worth mentioning here, you are a chiropractor, so obviously you knew the sort of structure of the spine and so on. For people that are sort of interested in doing this, by themselves, working on whatever condition they may have, is it essential to understand the exact, exactly what's going on, and kind of trying to sort of think that through to change that in your mind?
Well, I don't recommend anybody that was in my position to do what I did. It's, I'm not endorsing people to not, to break from conventional treatment. I just made that choice because I just knew the outcome based on my background in spinal dynamics. But it doesn't matter what the health condition is. I mean, if you're really interested in making changes in your health, I think that one of the things you have to do is you have to begin to realize that we are way more than what we think we are, and anybody can begin a journey into overcoming certain things about themselves if they just understand a little bit about themselves.
I want to move on to talk about the sort of brain side and rewiring and so on. But before we do that, just on this theme, I know you sort of studied people going through similar things, working with spontaneous remissions that also did a similar thing to you. What was the feedback that you got from people that were doing that?
Well, from about 1999 through around 2006 or so, I traveled around the world studying people that were diagnosed with serious health conditions, whether it was cancer or diabetes or high blood pressure or chronic pain or lupus or MS and thyroid conditions, whatever. And they went through the typical protocol and were diagnosed with an objective test, and then they were either treating and staying the same or getting worse, and then all of a sudden they got better. And what I realized in interviewing these people is that the main thing they did was they changed their mind, and it was so exciting to me that I actually went back to school and got a degree in neuroscience, because I couldn't explain it with the typical conventional understanding of the way we view healing in the body. So it began beginning to piece together some of the principles that allow people to begin to have a change in their physical health.
And when you say they changed their mind, what did they do? What did they suddenly decide to do differently, or how did they suddenly decide to think differently?
Well, when I talk about changing your mind, I'm not talking about choosing, to eat pasta instead of eating a steak and potatoes. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an emphatic change in mind and body. And there were 4 things they had in common. The first thing, they all accepted that there was a spiritual aspect of them that was giving them life, that this vitalistic principle, this innate intelligence, this force, spirit, whatever you'd like to call it, universal mind, chi, whatever works for people, that there is a vitalistic component, this intelligence, this energy, this consciousness that is, pretty much organizing health and order in the person's body. And we as free-willed individuals get to choose and not choose, and there's something that's objective and that's consistent and has an intelligence. And so they decided, just like I thought at the time, that they would begin to interact with it and develop a relationship with a two-way relationship with it, ask it to begin to work through them and in them and all around them, and begin to produce changes. And so that's the first thing they had in common. The second thing they had in common is that they began to realize that it was their mismanagement of their own attitude and their own emotional reactions that began to create their disease. It was their 20 years of anger or their 30 years of hatred. It was, the guilt that they lived by every single day, or the fear that they memorized as an emotional state that became part of their personality. And they said, I have to just break the habit of being myself. I have to begin to change the way I think and change the way I feel. And I have to stop behaving in these predictable ways. And so they began to decide who they no longer wanted to be, how they no longer wanted to think. And the principle in neuroscience begins to tell us that we can actually change our circuitry and change our emotional addictions, because biology actually supports it. So they began to change their mind in that way, that they stopped thinking and feeling in a certain way, then feeling and thinking another way. And the cycle of thinking a thought that produces a chemical for you to feel a certain way. Once you feel a certain way, you begin to think equal to the way you feel. And people do that for 20 or 30 years on end, and that repetition, that redundancy, conditions the body to memorize that state better than the conscious mind. And whenever the body knows better than the mind, that's called a habit. Habit is when the body is the mind. So people tend to memorize emotional states and thought processes and neurochemically condition their body into a subconscious program. And so they got serious enough to begin to say, I got to become conscious of my unconscious self, and I got to change it. And so that was the second thing they had in common. The third thing they had in common, which follows suit, is they said, I have to reinvent myself. I have to become somebody else. I can't think the same way. And who do I want to be? How do I want to live? What does a great person think about? Who in history do I admire? When do I fall from grace? And what do it feel to be free? And they started to think in different ways. And as they began to think about who they wanted to become, they began to make their brain fire in different sequences and patterns and combinations. And that process whenever you make the brain work differently, mind is the brain in action. They began to reproduce a new level of mind. And as they began to revisit or remind themselves each day on who they wanted to become, the principle of neuroscience says that nerve cells that fire together, wire together, they literally reorganized the circuits in their brain that became the platform of who they would become. And as they practiced it, it became more familiar to them. And then they started to have emotional components to connect with it. They started to feel like this new identity, this new ideal, and they were reconditioning their body to a new mind. They literally were becoming somebody else. And the last thing they had in common is that during the process of where they were reinventing a new idea of themselves, they had moments, long moments, where they lost track of time and space, that they expected it to be 15 or 20 minutes later when they were closing their eyes and thinking about who they wanted to become, and it was more like an hour and 15 or 20 minutes that went by. And the frontal lobe, the forebrain, is really the latest piece of machinery that we have, and when we're paying attention and we're truly focused, the frontal lobe acts like a volume control. It literally lowers the volume to time and space. We literally no longer feel our bodies. We no longer sense the environment, and we no longer are connected to the circuits in the brain that process time. And when we lose track of time and space, the thought becomes the experience. And when the thought becomes the experience, the brain captures the thought as the experience and then reframes the hardware to reflect the thought as the experience. And then once the thought is the experience, the end product of an experience is an emotion, and they started to feel like this new ideal. And the moment they started to feel like this new ideal, they literally were causing their body as the unconscious mind to actually perceive it was in the event ahead of the event. And that emotional experience ahead of the actual event began to cause them to recondition their body to a new mind, and they made their way out of their disease.
So basically, I mean, this is something you obviously spoke about at the workshop in depth, but basically you imagine you're where you want to be and just get into that feeling of being, be it healthy or in a new sort of life situation. You're saying that basically then it kind of finds you. Yeah, and I don't want to trivialize this, because these people struggled with their identity. They struggled with their personality. But before they decided who they wanted to be and what their life would be like and how they would feel, I mean, they decided who they no longer wanted to be. And that's equally important, because to change your life is to change your energy. So you have to literally lose your mind and create a new one. You have to unlearn who you are and relearn who you want to be. You have to break the habit of the old self and reinvent a new self. You have to prune synaptic connections. Actually, biologically, nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. So when you stop thinking the same way and acting the same way and feeling the same way, you're shutting the lights out in that area of the brain, and those circuits begin to lose their long-term relationship. They begin to prune away. And when you're deciding who you do want to be and you're really on it, and you're really focused on that, the brain actually flourishes and sprouts new connections. So we have to also unmemorize the emotions that we memorize by that cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking, and then we have to recondition the body to a new mind or a new emotion. And once we liberate that energy, because that consciousness, that state of mind and body is literally stuck in the body, and as we begin to trade that off for a new identity, for a new aspect of self, it transcends the concept of positive thinking, because many people think positively with their conscious mind, but 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old sits in a subconscious memory system, which we've memorized a set of behaviors and emotional reactions that act like automatic programs. So the person's going to then all of a sudden think positively, but they've memorized negativity, and that's mind and body working in opposition. So we have to go into the operating system of the subconscious and become conscious of those behaviors and bring them to conscious awareness so that we have more control over them and they don't go by unnoticed by us in our normal life. So it's more than just, getting in touch with how it would feel to be in a new life. You have to get very clear, first of all, in mind who you want to be. The mind is the compass, and then the emotion is the wind behind you. And so the emotion then drives the very state of being. So you have to couple both mind and emotion, thoughts and feelings, and then when we do, it's not enough to just do it once. We really have to be able to remind ourselves, reproduce the same level of mind every day, and that's when we begin to see measurable changes.
before the event actually takes place.
Okay, now at the workshop, you spoke at length about the chemical structure in the body. It's like a sort of addiction to the chemical that the body produces. Could you kind of outline that for us in a bit more detail?
Sure. I mean, we're all pretty much addicted to some emotion, some state. There's nothing wrong with emotions. Emotions are the end product of experience, and we can remember experiences better because we can remember how they feel. The problem is that according to the psychological model, 90% of human thoughts and emotions are negative. And the reason that they're negative is because the emotions that we use when we react to the external world, when we're threatened or when we're aggressive or when we're mad or when we're sad, those emotions come from a very primitive nervous system. They come from the survival centers in the brain and body. And when you have an emotional reaction, you turn on that fight or flight nervous system. And that fight or flight nervous system is there to mobilize enormous amounts of energy so that when the body has a threat from the external world, it can take care of its body in the environment within a certain amount of time. And those chemicals really produce the emotions of anger and hatred and judgment and frustration and fear and anxiety and insecurity and pain and suffering and hopelessness and powerlessness and depression. Those emotions that are derived from those chemicals of stress are derived from those chemicals of stress, not in the short term. I mean, we're all designed to handle short-term stress. It's when we turn on that stress response and it stays on for longer than just 15 minutes or a half an hour, that it stays on for hours at a time. And when we turn on the stress response and we can't turn it off, now we're headed for disease. Now, those chemicals, because they mobilize enormous amounts of energy, give the body a rush. It gives it a high, and we unconsciously begin to associate the problems in our life with feeling alive. So the bad relationship or the terrible job or the rough circumstances in our life, people unconsciously crave those to reinforce themselves as a personality so they can get that rush of energy so they can feel alive. And that's when people wind up in trouble, because those chemicals cause us to become very selfish. They cause us to focus on ourselves. We become self-indulgent and self-important and self-centered, because that's what those chemicals do. They cause us to over-focus on the self. And when that happens now, we're working from a lower denominator, and we tend to then, in our lives, very easily look for an emotional rush, emotional gratification, or something to make that either continue that feeling or make another feeling go away. And that's when we wind up in trouble.
Joe, a couple more questions for you. Also from the workshop, you were talking about how when you get into that sort of stillness, when you come into the now, you spoke about how you have a whole range of things that can manifest for you whatever you want, and it happens at an atomic level, which is a quite sort of mind-blowing concept. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, because of the size of the frontal lobe, we have the ability to be so focused on what we're thinking about that we actually lose track of time and space. And we all do it all the time. We're focused on a thought so well that when we're paying attention to that thought, that there comes a moment where we lose track of ourselves. That identity is lost. And when the identity gets lost, that's when we literally make a physiological change in brain and body. And that little moment where there is no body, there is no thing, there is no time, that moment where we become selfless, that moment where we're so involved in the moment, we're so present with what we're attending to, that we disappear, that we forget about ourselves. There's a physiological change that happens in the brain where the frontal lobe begins to not only act like a volume control, but really cool off the circuits in the rest of the brain that are processing the sensory feelings of the body or the motor function of the body. The lights go out in that area.
Are we talking about meditation here?
Well, in a sense, yeah, when we're meditating, or even when we're paying attention. When we're creating, actually would be a best word to use. When we're actually being present and we're in the process of speculation, that brain, the rest of the brain begins to cool off. And if there is no mind, because there's no brain activity, then we're really unaware of the body, the environment, and time. Now, the moment we lose track of the body, the environment, time, and we become selfless, we're literally walking through the door to the quantum field. We can't enter the quantum field as a somebody. We have to enter as a nobody. We have to be able to lose track of ourselves and begin to become so immersed in thought that we become whatever we're focused on. And that's the moment that we begin to broadcast effects in the quantum field. And we all have the machinery. We all have the necessary hardware and components to be able to do that.
All right, I actually wanted to ask you, in relation to what you're saying here, it's quite interesting, and I noticed from sort of working with you over the weekend, the stuff I've done previously is about kind of getting into that still place that you're talking about, letting go of everything. And a lot of the stuff that I've worked with is about just allowing whatever comes to come. It's going to happen. Whereas from working with you, it seemed much more like sort of perhaps like The Secret or cosmic ordering, where you're actually directing yourself towards something. What would you say on that? I mean, there seems to be sort of two slightly different schools of thought on that.
Well, I think there's a real balance between intention and surrender. I think that there are two elements that are in the that we use in the process of creation, and I think that we can't overfocus, we can't force, because when we have intention and we're forcing it, that turns into trying. And yet, at the same time, there is an element of surrender where we have to actually get out of the way and let something else greater than us begin to move through us. And I don't think one is more powerful than the other, but what I do know is that those different forms of meditation, sometimes when we're receiving information, when we're getting in touch with, intuition, or getting in touch with signals from the field, that is, when we're looking for answers, when we're beginning to tune in to possibilities, when we're on the receiving end, and at the same time, when we're creating and we want something to happen, we want to affect reality in some way, and we want to make a difference in our lives. It takes a little bit of intention. It takes getting clear on what we want, and so the combination of the two, getting clear on what we want, that's intention, and then surrendering and getting out of the way is another key ingredient. And so I think it's a dance between the two, and I think if we have one without the other, if we have intention without surrender, the ego's in the way and it's trying too hard. And if we have surrender without any intention, the wind is blowing and we're not moving in a specific direction. So I from a personal standpoint, I think there's many forms of meditation, and you can go either way to produce the outcomes,
All right, well, if people are interested in following up to what you're talking about and trying to work with this, what is the way to do that, would you suggest? Well,
it just depends on how deep they want to go. We have a monthly service on our website on drjoedispenza.com. It's a teleclass where people can, join the teleclass. It's very inexpensive, and it allows people to ask questions, and I interact with them. And I wrote a book called Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind. You can go to the website and find out about workshops and different, lectures that I do around the world. There's a new book coming out called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, and that's kind of the practical how-to. So we try to provide as many different venues for people.
Could you just give us your website
Sure,
address again?
It's just drjoedispenza.com, drjoedispenza.com.
All right. Joe, I'd like to thank you again for the workshop at the weekend. It was fantastic. And thank you so much for coming on tonight to talk to our listeners and talk us through what you're doing. It's amazing. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Energy. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
You've been listening to an interview from spiritualmatters.org.